Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, Jon Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you.
So good to be with you today and have this conversation. And I just wanted to open with a few brief comments and then we'll kind of get into some of the dialogue. As we're wrapping up this series, we've been trying to envision a fuller picture of grace in community, and it's about an intersection between our own personal spiritual well-being and faith and our social wellness. The reality is that the way that Indigenous peoples in the Americas have been treated throughout history hasn't been that full picture of grace that we've been talking about in this series, and sometimes we need to look at what's not right to better envision what can be right. Back in 2016, the ELCA Churchwide Assembly adopted a resolution repudiating the doctrine of discovery as an example of, quote, the improper mixing of the power of the church and the power of the sword. And it called the church as a whole to acknowledge and repent from the church's complicity in the evils of colonialism in the Americas, which continue to harm tribal governments and individual tribal members. And I think we often look for what separates us from other people, what makes us different, and often that can grow out of control and become dangerous. And in the case of Native peoples, our failure historically to find a common humanity resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Native people in forced assimilation. It may seem to be something in the past now, and yet it continues to have lasting impacts that we can at least acknowledge and find additional ways forward that can bring healing. So again, I want to thank Brenda for you being here, and I wonder if you could just share a little bit about yourself as we start.
Yeah. Hananchi nikarigiwina chachsebskainga higaire. Hello to all of you. I'm chachsebskainga, but you can all call me by my English name, which is Brenda Blackhawk. As Pastor Jon said, I worked at the Synod for almost 4 years as the congregational organizer for racial justice. But I grew up in the Lutheran Church. I'm from the Twin Cities. I grew up in both the Lutheran Church and the Native American Church, which are just both different expressions of Christianity. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk with y'all and you, Pastor Jon, of course.
Great. So one of the things that you've done a lot of reflection on and teaching about over the course of your time with the Minneapolis Area Synod and just more broadly relates to the history of colonization and how that impacted Indigenous peoples here in North America and really throughout the world as well. But most of us are generally aware of colonialism, and we did our high school history classes, and we know how 13 colonies resisted that kind of oppression and declared independence. And yet, I think a lot of us haven't fully grasped maybe how that same philosophy that the colonies fought against sort of continued on and perpetuated that same spirit of domination, and we kind of played that out here towards Native peoples and others, and haven't maybe fully reflected on that and that legacy and what that means for Native peoples in North America, and also kind of how the church became a part of that as well. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I would say that the basis for colonization as we recognize it today, actually, the foundation for that was really laid in the church. You mentioned the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, but not everybody knows what the doctrine of discovery even is.
Right.
And what it was is back in between like 1452 and 1490 something, the popes were writing papal bulls, basically kind of, a doctrine of a sort, for kings who were going out trying to conquer and discover land. And so the church literally wrote, and I actually wrote down a direct quote from one of the bulls. So there was 3 bulls. The first one declared war on anyone who was not a Christian. Mm-hmm. So the doctrine is 3 bulls. And that first one, yes. The second one then gave permission to kings to invade and conquer any lands that were occupied by non-Christians and to use those resources of the land however they wanted and enslave the people as well. And then the third one was written the year after Columbus landed in the New World. And this is a direct quote. It demanded that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. So these 3 papal bulls really laid the groundwork for colonization of the world. Mm-hmm. Including, I think a lot of times in the U.S. we talk about it very much from this mindset of how it's affected Indigenous peoples here, but also I think it's important to remember that the reason that we had African slaves here is from that same mentality, right? So that their history of colonization is very deeply tied up with ours. Mm-hmm. So yes, it was global. There was 3 things I really wanted to say about this. So it was global, that you already mentioned. Another thing that folks don't realize is that the United States government actually uses the doctrine of discovery in Indian law, and as the basis of land ownership in this country. So to be clear, let me just say it again. They use this religious doctrine in our government, which is supposed to keep a separation of state and religion, right? So and again, it seems like it's a long time ago, but as recent as 2005, the Supreme Court ruled against the Oneida Nation's case. What they tried to do was they bought land. Mm-hmm. They bought some of their traditional homeland, and they wanted to bring it into part of their tribal sovereignty. And the Supreme Court denied it on the basis of the doctrine of discovery, and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually wrote and named the doctrine specifically in her opinion as to why they denied the Oneida people. And then the last thing I'll say, and you did mention this a little bit, is that colonization is still happening. It's not over. Mm-hmm. And the effects of it are very real for Indigenous people all over the world. In fact, individually, they've shown now, scientists have shown that it's altered our DNA. The trauma of colonization has altered the DNA of human beings. So the trauma that my ancestors experienced lives in my body. And it affects me in many different ways. But then also how it affects us in our communities. So we have this loss of language and culture, and then that shows up too in the form of poverty and desperation and addiction and all kinds of issues that are really hard to deal with. And it feels, I think I wrote this one line here, it's Indigenous people still live in the colonizer's world, and it's not something we can be free from. So it's ongoing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And this whole kind of concept of colonization, I think you talked about the papal bulls, mm-hmm. and one of my first classes in seminary was on how we're living in a post-Constantine world. And really, in some ways, all of this goes back to the 300s, when the Emperor Constantine, you had kind of an early church in the first few centuries that was, in many ways, persecuted and lived very differently. And then Emperor Constantine was on the eve of a battle, a pivotal battle in taking control of Rome, and claimed to have seen a symbol of essentially the cross in the sky and the words, "By this conquer." And from that moment, we have lived with a Christian movement that has this understanding that you can conquer by the name of Jesus, which is really messed up. And in some ways, we look back at that and think, oh, great, Christian faith, expanded, and everything went from being a persecuted faith to now in power. But that has really messed with so many aspects of our identity and who we are. And that has been played out even through, when you think about just the establishment of religion in societies, how, countries were considered Christian, and in many ways, modern Christians lament that, that somehow the church is not the established order anymore.
Yeah.
But in many ways, it's an important reckoning, and we need to come to terms with that. And in many ways, our country was founded on the idea that the church should not be established, but we should treat everyone more equally, which is a good start. But there's still those effects, as you just described. The colonization has played out anyway. And we haven't fully embraced all the different aspects of that movement that started in the 300s. And how do we embrace the core of Christian faith? So you talked about the continuing legacy of this and impacts that this, colonization still continues. And the reality of boarding schools, too, has been a pivotal piece of history. Say more on that.
Yeah. So to talk about that, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about my great-grandmother. So she lived to be 103. Her name was Minnie Gray Wolf Little Bear. And she was, 103. So she's amazing. And so she died when I was 11. She's the one who gave me my Ho-Chunk name. She was a really funny lady. My brother and my family and I, we all came to visit. He was maybe 3. And she took one look at him and said, "Oh, he's got the devil in his eyes." Which was pretty accurate. And she had this big sweet tooth. She loved ice cream. Loved ice cream. And so I have these memories of her, but the memories I don't have are of her speaking English. I never heard her speak a word of English. My grandfather, my choka, and my jaji, my father, would translate. But you kind of just knew what she was saying anyways. But I didn't learn until years and years later, after she had passed, that part of the reason that she never spoke English was because she had spent time in boarding schools. So they would take children at the age of 5 and bring them to these really concentration camps disguised as schools, and hundreds of miles away. But my grandmother, her family hid her for a couple of years, so she didn't get taken until she was 7 or 8. But she did. She went to Genoa U.S. Industrial School. She talked about it a little bit with my grandmother, and she told me that she would labor in the kitchens. That was part of her job. So she'd be up before the sun every day baking bread. She recalled that when her mother was allowed to come visit her, they slept in the same bed, and that she wasn't allowed to speak Ho-Chunk. And when she did, they would hit her, they were mean to her. And so when she was finally free of the school and able to leave, she never again spoke a word of English. which I understand. So I think that the Indian boarding schools are a perfect example of colonization in the world, and they actually, the history of them really stems back to the doctrine of discovery. Because the United States, it's a fledgling country in the early 1800s, and they bought all this land, right? The Louisiana Purchase and all of that, and they start doing this manifest destiny, right? This idea, this westward expansion, that this is the promised land, which is words directly from the Old Testament, right? That this promised land for these people, right? Well, the problem is that there's already people living there, right, and who didn't take kindly to folks coming in and taking things and disrespecting the land and disrespecting them. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of conflicts and people were scared. So the words the Indian problem, this was what they wanted to do. They wanted to find a way to get rid of the Indian people so that they could have this expansion the way that they wanted. So again, those roots in the doctrine of discovery. But they found out that Native people were really hard to kill. They did a really good job of it, I will say. In fact, such a good job of it that many people don't actually know this, but Hitler, when he was doing his genocide out in Germany, he studied what the U.S. government did with indigenous peoples to figure out how he could as quickly and efficiently get rid of the Jews as possible. We resisted, and we were here. We stayed. We weren't destroyed, and honestly, there was a big outcry from the public. There was a lot of people, white folks living in the colonies and in this new country, who saw what was happening and resisted as well, and they spoke out against it. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. government eventually had to stop trying to just kill us, and there was this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pratt, and he had this idea of assimilation. He believed that you could kill the Indian and save the man. The idea that we could remove everything about these people that is Indian, and they could essentially be taught to live as white people in the world, in general society. So the kids would go to these schools, and they would be forced to have their hair cut. They couldn't wear their traditional clothes. They couldn't speak their traditional languages. They were often beaten if those things happened. And one of the main things is that they were forced to not practice their traditional religions, and they had to be Christian. They had to become Christian. Now, the U.S. government had something like, I think, a total of 300 or almost 400 schools. I think the number currently as it stands. And about 100 or so of those schools were run by churches. So eventually the government started contracting out to churches to run these schools. And the stories that you hear from folks who survived church schools often talk about them as being worse than the government-run schools. There was a lot more emotional and mental and sexual abuse that happened in the church schools. And a lot of that language still exists in really evangelical communities. In fact, recently we had an instance on the Pine Ridge Reservation where an evangelical-style Christian came in and told the folks practicing traditional religion that they were worshiping the devil and that they had to stop and come to God and all of this kind of language, right? So it still exists in the Christian world. I mean, this was this year that this happened. So they say, the Synod, when I was working there, we did a lot of partnering with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which has a really great website. They have a tab even specifically that talks about the history of churches in there, and they've listed out all of the boarding schools run by churches that they know of. And I keep saying that they know of, and because so many records were not kept, and so many records have been hidden away, and many times this organization and others have gone to churches and to request access to records and are denied. So it's something that's being hidden and kept away. But there's a minimum estimate of 240,000 kids who went through these schools. And as you probably know, it's been in the media a lot lately, is that in Canada copied the US's model for schools, and they had what they call residential schools there. And they started doing, in the last couple years, a really deep dive into particularly the children who died at schools. And so there's been over 15,000 bodies found of children just in the Canadian schools. They haven't started looking at the US schools yet. And this is something that us Native folks have always known has happened. And we always knew that they were there, but, people didn't want to believe us. And so that's, and I want to also be clear too that when we talk about these schools, a lot of times Catholic schools, right? There was a lot of Methodist schools, there was a lot of Baptist schools, right? But there were Lutheran schools. Mm-hmm. The Lutherans did have Indian boarding schools, including, I think the most well-known one is in Wisconsin, which is the traditional homelands of my people. So, So I just want to name that because I think a lot of times Lutherans say, "Oh, well, we didn't do that. Mm-hmm. That wasn't what we did." Well, we did. Yeah. So, that's a little bit about that and how the church has been involved in that history. Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to take in and difficult to hear. Talk about kind of challenges for Indigenous peoples today, and what's that legacy like for today? Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of the challenges that Indigenous people have today are pretty public, I think. One big one that I've talked about many times and is about representation and appropriation. I remember being a kid and people friends in school finding out that, "Oh, you're Native? Oh, do you guys live in a teepee?" That's the image people have for Native folks because that's been the representation so long in popular media. And people talk about us like we're not there anymore. That's how you end up with things like Indian mascots, which are super offensive. I've gotten into many arguments with white folks who, "Oh, well, I don't think it's offensive." Well, I'm literally telling you, I'm Native. I'm literally telling you it's offensive. And then Halloween costumes are another one, right? It's like we're not really here, so we can't be offended by it, but we are, and we are. I don't know if anybody here watches Res Dogs. Highly recommend that show. It's on Hulu. It's a great image of modern Native folks. So highly recommend that. But so those kinds of things are starting to happen, which is amazing, but it's 2022, and it took us this long to get here. Another big one that has been public over the last years is around environmental justice, especially with pipelines coming through Indigenous lands. Dakota Access was a big thing a few years ago. And, a lot of times with the land acknowledgements, y'all have a land acknowledgement, it's named these are the original stewards of this land, right? And it's true. And so our people are still fighting hard to care for the land. Another big issue is around the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That's this symbol here that you've maybe seen around. So Native women are murdered or go missing at a rate 10 times higher than the national average. And so I have these exact numbers. So 5,712 cases right now exist for missing and murdered Indigenous women, but the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, has only 116 cases that they have open. This is something that it doesn't get the news media coverage that it should. And what's interesting about this, so oftentimes when we talk about sexual assault and murder, those things are happening within racial groups the majority of the time. But when it comes to Indigenous women, it's actually the opposite. So most of the time it is non-Native people coming onto Native land and doing this to Indigenous women. And because federal Indian law is so messed up, they get away with it. Wow. So, so that's a big issue. And then another one is around the foster care system. So one of the things I like to say about when I talk about Indian boarding schools is that they haven't gone away, they've evolved. So these schools existed from the late 1800s, I think 1869 the first one opened, into the 1960s, 70s. And then we went through this era that evolved into this adoption era where Native children were taken from their Native families and adopted by white families. This was a huge thing that happened. Like hundreds or thousands and thousands of Native kids were taken this way. And then that evolved into the current child welfare system, and where Native families are targeted, for one thing. And so in Minnesota, Native Americans make up a very tiny percentage of the people who are here, but they make up a huge percentage. Almost a quarter of all child welfare, child protection cases are Native cases. And the federal government in the late 70s, I want to say 1979, passed a law called the Indian Child Welfare Act, where Native children are supposed to be placed in homes and with families who are also of Native descent. And they have like a tier system, right? So the first thing is they want you to be with a relative or somebody from your own tribe, and then it will just be any Native person they can find, right? They have this long list. My family, when I turned 20, my parents said, okay, we're gonna be foster parents. And so they started doing that. And they had over 100 Native children come through their home in the 12 years that they did that. Wow. And then through that, both my mother and my sister became, they work for the state now, they're guardian ad litems, so their job is to work for the Native children and to help them find resources and be reunited with their families. So that's a huge issue. There's actually a Supreme Court case right now that is challenging ICWA, and we're waiting to hear a decision on that sometime in the near future, which makes many of us nervous. And then the final thing that I'll say is the land back movement. So the U.S. government made very unfair treaties that were never honored with Native tribes to have all of the land that they that the government has and that we all live on. So the land back movement is really this idea that Native people should be the ones in control of the land and the resources, and to do that. And so part of what that looks like for the church is that a lot of churches are starting to give, not a lot of churches, there's a few churches that are starting to give the land back. So when their building closes, they give the land back to Native people. And there's even talk about churches who are still there, and they're like, we're going to give the land back anyways. And they build relationship with tribal communities, and and they have a good partnership. So that's part of that. One interesting story I will say about that is, the U.S. government finally agreed to pay for the Black Hills. I don't know if everybody knows about the history of the Black Hills, but the Black Hills was promised. It's a sacred site for Lakota people. And the U.S. government found gold. They found gold in the Black Hills, and so they had promised this land to them, and then they just took it without treaty or anything. They just took that land from the Lakota people because they had found gold. And so, so the U.S. government finally said, we're gonna pay you the billions of dollars or whatever for all of that. But the Lakota people said no. They're still saying no. This is years now that they've been saying no. We want the land back. Give it back to us. We don't want your money. So that's ongoing. But so I think that's just a really clear image of what Indigenous people are going to prioritize, and we're going to prioritize the land. So yeah, those are just a couple of, sorry, that's more than a couple, but there's a lot of issues. I could go on, but those are a couple of the big ones.
Appreciate you sharing that. So, I mean, you've talked about all this today,
Yeah.
colonization, boarding schools, issues you're still dealing with, and you were raised Lutheran, you're Christian. How do you put all this together? What is meaningful for you about Christian faith, especially in the context of all this? And
Yeah.
yeah,
So I don't know if I could be a Christian if I wasn't Lutheran. There's something beautiful about grace, right? That I think is, and the ELC in particular, I think does a really good job of talking about the hard things, which I appreciate. But I think the biggest thing for me about being Christian is that Jesus teaches the same things that our Indigenous people teach.
interesting.
And our like the same values are taught by Jesus again. And so it doesn't feel foreign. It feels traditional. And I'm part of the American Indian Alaska Native Lutheran Association. And so one of the things we talk about, there's not a lot of us, but of us that there are, we talk a lot about how Jesus was indigenous. He was indigenous. He was of that place and in that place and time. And so a lot of those, this culture may have been different, but he suffered under empire, right? Those stories align very well with the stories of Indigenous people here. So yeah, I think it's, for me, probably because I was raised, right? It's easy to find those commonalities and to see that shared story.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Final question, just for folks who, maybe are hearing some of this for the first time. I mean, most people are generally aware that, Native peoples inhabited these lands before, but not all of us had gone deeply into that before. Some of this is hard to hear. But for those who are looking to respond in some way, not asking you to fix all of this, but what would be some next steps for people if they want to respond and help create a different, way forward?
Yeah. The first thing I'll say is that I'm an action-oriented person, so I relate to the feeling of, oh man, this is messed up. I want to go out and fix it, right? And when it comes to stuff like this, my first ask is to not do that. It's to listen. Because there's so much to learn. So listen and learn. Do your own research is one thing, right? It's fine it's good to have relationships with folks and ask them to tell you things. That's great. But learning, there's a lot of information out there. So doing some of that research on your own is really important, taking the opportunity to learn. And then talking to other people about it is a huge one, especially talking to other white people about it. Because I can sit and talk to white folks all day long, and if they're not open to it, then they're not open to it, and it doesn't matter what I say. Like I said, I've argued with white people about whether or not mascots are offensive, right? Other things like that. And they think it's something that they can just argue with me about, which is kind of dehumanizing, really. And so white people to take on those arguments and those kinds of things and help other white people learn and open their hearts and minds to those things is so important in any racial justice work, but especially with this. And then the last thing I'll say is to support Indigenous communities, which means showing up and following Indigenous leadership when they ask for it. So there will be moments, like I talked about that ICWA Supreme Court case, right? There's going to be an Indian boarding school bill that's going to come through the Minnesota legislature in the next year or two that's going to help us dig deeper into that history and force churches and private organizations to share their history and stuff with us. So those are places that white folks can and should show up, and following Indigenous leadership, be supportive of those kinds of things. So yeah, I think that those, and I know it's hard. I get that it's hard because I am also an action-oriented person. I want to go out and fix it. So I understand that that's hard, but learning and listening and following are the most important things folks can do.
Great, thank you. And you are going to be available after the service out in the fellowship hall for conversation, questions and answers. We can kind of frame that however we want, one-on-one or as a group, whoever is a part of that. So thank you again so much, Brenda, for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.